13. The Old Friend. Chell plunged into the spiraling tube of the excursion funnel feet first, her stomach giving a single giddy lurch as the soft, slow-moving stream killed her momentum and brought her fall to an immediate drifting stop. The translucent bluish material of the funnel ghosted over her skin like a dusty breeze, drifting in fine-spun eddies from her fingers. Before she could let herself hesitate, she brought the portal gun up fast and fired, once, into the darkness. A burst of blue flared on a pale, near-invisible wall far ahead of her, the socky, aimless "thipt" of an opening portal. Behind her, the oval of stars and silvery glass flicked out of existence, sealing the way back. She refused to allow herself to think about what had just happened, about Wheatley, about what he'd tried to say, about the horror-struck look she'd seen dawning on his face the split second before she turned away. She denied it, the whole subject. It was only practical for her to do so. The situation demanded nothing else. She couldn't afford to waste concentration on her feelings. Not in here, where the slightest hesitation could get you killed in a heartbeat. She forced herself to focus. Stretching her unnatural powers of mental segregation to the limit, she grabbed the whole hurtling, splintering, unraveling chunk of her that had become tangled up in him, and shut it away behind a cold, slamming wall in the back of her mind, where it howled faintly at her but couldn't interfere. Instead, she turned her attention to her surroundings, dim, hazy, vast. She was drifting at the center of a long pencil beam of twisting blue light, arrow straight between two endless charcoal black walls over an endless drop. The emitter was a bright triple-spinning speck far behind her, weaving an infinite funnel web that held her in place like a bug in amber. "There you are." The excursion funnel winked out, and she fell through the haze, bracing herself for the inevitable. She had a confused impression of thick, dust-buried panels far below her. 30 feet, 20, 10, the panels sliding quicksilver fast over each other in a stirred-up cloud of fluff and ash, opening a dark, tessellating gash in the floor. She plunged through, hurtling down through a blur of charcoal darkness, and landed, clunk, feet first, on a smooth, clean, steel-gray surface. She straightened up. In the dim underfloor glow, she could make out the two familiar shapes of a standard elevator chamber, the slick, dead, wall-to-ceiling LCOS monitor screens which usually displayed the aperture equivalent of a screensaver. Instructional videos and waving stick figures, taunting stock footage of fields and grass. Her throat felt thick, full of a foul plastic taste, the disturbed dust, or maybe the liquid asbestos of the funnel, and she coughed and spat, wiping her mouth on the back of her free hand. "I'd like to think that, in your language, that's what passes for a civilized greeting, but we both know I'd be kidding myself," said the voice. "I mean, really. Would you do that in your place? Because even if you would, this is not your place. This is my place. And your mucus is not a required part of the decor." Chell stared flat, blank-eyed hatred up at the nearest glassy red lens. There were 3 cameras in this smallish space, tracking her every movement. She, evidently, had wanted to make some kind of point. Hefting the gun in her hands, she circled the chamber, around the empty socket where the elevator should have been, looking for a portal surface, a crack, a sign, a way to begin. "I can tell you're eager to get started," said the voice. "That's good. So am I. I think we should go over a few ground rules first. So far, we haven't exactly been reading off the same page. It's a shame, because my page makes fascinating reading. It's all about science. Your page, on the other hand, was written by a mute, destructive psychopath who really can't take a joke. I think, in future, we should just stick to my page." This was a perfectly straightforward request, or at least it was worded like one, and it deserved a straightforward answer. With her eyes fixed firmly on the camera's unblinking red eye, Chell took a very deliberate step back and rammed the butt of the portal gun into the nearest monitor panel. There was a sweet sound of shattering silicon, and a dying fritz of static. "Vital testing apparatus destroyed." announced a synthetic voice. "All right, look," she said. "I'm going to be honest. You're good at this." That's not a compliment, by the way. It's just a statistical observation. The fact remains that in the face of overwhelming odds, despair is a perfectly natural, healthy response. Other humans give up when it becomes obvious that the situation is hopeless. You don't. There is something seriously wrong with you, and that's what makes you so perfect. Having given up on the inactive socket of the elevator as a possible way out, Chell felt across the walls, palms hissing on the flat monitor screens. The cameras tracked her as she moved, their scarlet eyes fixed on her back. It's funny, when you think about it. The one trait that makes you so invaluable as a test subject is also the trait that makes you the biggest threat to my existence that I've ever encountered. Now that I've had the opportunity of observing you at close quarters, much closer than I ever wanted, believe me, I've realized that your destructive tendencies only surface when you're trying to protect something you regard as valuable. Up until now, that's usually been your own life. I can't exactly remove that as a factor. We both know I need you alive. And you don't seem to be afraid of pain or physical injury. I have access to test data from hundreds of humans right here in my database, so I think I'm qualified to tell you that's something else that makes you the freak here. A pause, carefully timed to give the appearance of consideration. Anyway, I was reorganizing the files that the moron trashed when he was in my body, and I came across an interesting quote. A famous philosopher once said that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I know, remarkably apt, right? Reading that made me realize we've just been going round in circles this whole time. I threaten your life, and you recklessly, violently attempt to endanger mine. I'm actually pretty embarrassed about this. All the time I've been blaming you for your selfish, psychotic behavior. It's really been all my fault. Chell looked up, slowly. The cameras gazed back down at her, calm, pitiless, hungry. I just haven't been giving you the right motivation. All around the chamber, panel by panel, in a spreading, multiplying rush, the monitor screens flicked into life. At first glance, each panel appeared to show the same image. A slow-moving, slightly distorted panorama shot of a small room. A security feed in flickery, washed-out color. Just an anonymous little cell, plain gray walls, a bed. Chell stood like a statue, the gun hanging forgotten by her side, staring up at the floor-to-ceiling mosaic of monitor screens, a grid of harsh sparks reflected by her horrified eyes. No. The same bed, the same walls, different rooms, and there they were, there they all were. Martin and Heather, Ellie, barely a bump in the cover of the queen-sized cryobed, Lars and Emily, Bill, Dina, Karen, Lindsay, the twins, hardly bigger than Ellie, and God knew how many chambers apart. Romy, Garrett, Aaron. More, so many more, and she knew without any doubt that if she counted, there would be 114 exactly, because it was all of them, every single one. A helpless ball of wet tension rose in her chest, clawed and burning. She bit down on the sore place on her tongue until she felt it split, her mouth filling with coppery warmth. The pain was thick and savage, and just enough to lodge the choking ball in place at the back of her throat. Her stomach was heaving, and her eyes felt like hot stones in their sockets, but she struggled with everything she had left to keep them dry. The pain was bad, but she'd rather bite her tongue clean off than give her the satisfaction. "You know, I'm kind of impressed," remarked the voice. The camera feeds panned in lazy side-by-side unison, back, forth, giving the entire chamber a queasy illusion of motion. "When I told them to bring back anyone they could find, I was pretty sure I'd have to settle for the moron, or maybe that cube you cared about so much, for someone so basically unlikable. You certainly seem to have made a lot of friends. Of course, most of them probably aren't really your friends, but hey, We can have fun finding that out. Chell heard. In some dim, red hell-lit place in her head, she was recording every word the hated voice said, but nothing showed on her face. She stared straight ahead at the screen which was showing her Romy's cryo-chamber. She would have recognized that pale, dreaming face a mile away, even without the unmissable, sheepy, piled-up blaze of hair that framed it, flame-bright against the colorless pillow. For now, though, this is how we're going to do this. You're going to test, and you're not going to break anything, or trespass in restricted areas, or try to murder me, or conspire to rip me out of my body and put me in root vegetables. And listen, take your time. I mean it. I've put a lot of effort into working out these new tests, so I don't want you to feel like you have to rush. Now that I've renovated the relaxation center, each of these cryo units have a shelf life of around 3,000 years, give or take a couple hundred, so I don't see spoilage becoming much of an issue this time around. They'll all be fine. The elevator lock turned with a smooth hiss, the capsule gliding gently anti-clockwise into view through the glass, the doors sliding open at Chell's back. If you behave. The screens snapped off. Chell backed away, took an automatic sleepwalker step backwards in the sudden darkness. Then another. A third took her across the threshold, and the elevator doors folded closed around her, like a curious child cupping an insect in its palm. The elevator was exactly as she remembered, too. A dim, rounded glass closet, close and claustrophobic, blue uplighting pulsing faintly around the walls from dull, glowing tubes set into the grayish panels around hip height. It began to move, shuddering underfoot, a giant throat rumbling in a satisfied purr. There were no cameras visible, but that didn't mean there were no cameras at all. Chell knew by now that there was no place in here where you could ever be sure you were unobserved. She leaned back against the wall, listening to the hum of the motor. She couldn't shut out the memory of Romy's face, and before she could stop it, the image changed from now to back then. Romy, the first human she'd ever seen, through a mist of tired, blurred sickness that bright summer morning 4 years ago. "Oh, honey, it's all right. You're gonna be fine." "Mom, what's that blue stuff on her face?" "Max, Jason, I want you two to run as fast as you can back to town and get Dr. Dillon. Tell her there's... Hey, shh, sweetheart, don't move. You're safe now. You're gonna be fine." Romy, with her warm singer's voice and the confident, gentle, no-nonsense touch only being the mother of 2 accident-prone 10-year-olds could have trained. Romy and her wild drama queen moods and her silly nicknames and her sillier crushes on decades-dead film stars. Romy and her children, her friends, her neighbors, all of them, all of Eden, down here in the humming darkness, locked up in the sleeping shells of their bodies, halfway alive, as cold as the dead. The long sleep. Dimly, Chell registered that she was no longer leaning on the wall, that she was sitting against it with her feet splayed out before her, the surface freezing against her bare skin, where the slow slide down had pulled the hem of her sweater up to the small of her back. She looked like a puppet someone had tossed in the corner of the elevator. A puppet in a loosely knitted old sweater, with torn, scratched shins and a dull, shock-empty, dead-eyed face, hugging the portal gun against her chest. It was cold in its ceramic alloy shell, but there was a slight, radiating kind of heat to the heart of it. The soft glowing inner tube. It was just above her own body temperature, fevery warm, and she curled around it with a loose, reflexive movement, stayed there as the motor hummed and the elevator dropped deeper into the ground. It was nearly dawn. The sky was fading gray, the soft, fragile gray of bleached wood, or hair turning silver, and the stars were dying. At any other time, Wheatley might have wondered where they were off to in such a hurry, but now, with his head hidden in the long, slump-shouldered cross of his arms, he couldn't even see them. He was so hunched and folded in on himself that, even if he'd opened his eyes, he would have seen nothing but a crumpled blue swatch of his own tie, a thin slice of the gray-stitched aperture logo on his chest. She left me, 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 she left me. Yes, she'd left him. And that was panic and horror and hell enough on its own. But what was worse, 10, 100 to the power of 10, all the way up until you ran out of zeros worse, was the way she'd looked at him in that last second. Like she was summing up everything he was in her head and just writing it all off. Screwing that last precious little strip of paper up into a tiny ball and hurling it into space. And even worse than all that was just knowing how much it made sense. How much he knew, deep down, flat out, bottom line knew he deserved it. Because every time, that was how it worked. When you fail, you end up alone. He twitched, his fingers digging hard into his upper arms, went still. The pattern spun out through his mind, again and again, the miserable little spiral of cause and effect that had driven him scrabbling through his life like a spider trying to escape from a polished sink, clinging to the most hopeless of footholds and always, always sliding back down. Every time. The ultimate rule, the reward for all his failures, the one thing he hated and feared the most. When you fail, you end up here. It didn't matter that up until a short time ago he'd never seen this place before in his life. He still knew it inside out, knew it like he knew the bright code world behind his eyes, or the time-worn path of his management rail. Here wasn't any one fixed place. It was wherever you were. Here followed you, inside your head, whether it was a quiet dawnlit field or a dark, empty, smoke-stinking chamber, an endless circuit of overgrown tunnels or the glittering vacuum of space. Because here wasn't really a place at all. It was a feeling, a great hollow frozen hole with you at the bottom, cold and sick and utterly useless, small and stupid, and as alone as it was possible for anything to be. You're not human. Chell had never lied to him. She'd tried to show him that even if the truth hurt, he didn't have to hide from it, that he could be someone better than that, someone braver if not brighter, someone who wasn't so scared of looking stupid that they tried to look like someone else altogether. He'd nearly been that someone. Yesterday he touched it, like touching a frosty window with a warm hand will clear it for a while. If he tried, if he could nearly bring back what it had felt like, how for the first time since he could remember he'd really felt as if he wasn't missing anything. Not a trace of all that perpetual self-doubting panic gnawing at the back of his mind. How good that had felt! He drew his knees up tighter to his chest, the heavy curve of Foxglove's spiraled sheet metal hoof pressing into his back. He'd always been brilliant at imagining the worst thing that could possibly happen, whether he wanted to or not, and his imagination wasn't done with him yet, not by a long shot. It marched unstoppably onwards, dragging him after it, hell-bent on giving him the full tour. In his mind's eye he watched Eden crumble like the facility had crumbled, aging and weathering and empty, like a mouth without a tongue. He saw plants creeping hungrily up over the buildings and dragging them down into their foundations, paint flaking, metal rusting, colors fading, walls tumbling in shivering floods of cracked brick and concrete, windows falling from their frames in cloudy spills of dust-blown glass. He saw the streets breaking up in crazy root-shot zigzags, the square becoming nothing more than a raw dust bowl at the center of a huddle of anonymous ruins. As the world turned and the years passed, and he sat here in Foxglove's green-shrouded shadow until she crumbled too, because as long as his little slug of metal and microchips lasted, as long as the sun that still lurked just below the hazy gray horizon kept on doing its thing, he would live. He'd been happy about that before. Now no thought had ever seemed less kind. Kind. Garrett had been kind. Aaron, Romy, even tiny little Ellie Otten. They had all been kind to him. Maybe he had been kind, once, the human he'd been, before time and fear and damage had turned him into something that would do anything, to save its own skin. Chell had been unbelievably kind, risking her own life and her own freedom for him, despite everything he'd done. She'd stuck with him, even though it must have been obvious to her, to anyone in a 10-mile radius, let alone someone as brilliantly sharp as she was, that he'd never be anything but his own awkward, wittering, thoughtless, stupid, selfish self. He'd wanted to help. He'd wanted so badly to show her he could be brave, that he'd had her back. He'd wanted to stick with her until the end of the world, his or hers, it came to the same thing. But the moment he'd seen that portal, the cold blue path into her world on the other side, it had all fallen away, and something deafening and rock-solid in the front of his mind had screamed, "Terrible idea!" And he'd just been so afraid. "Hugh," he'd said once, "you're not afraid of anything." And she'd looked at him as if he'd been joking, but then her face had changed, subtly, and she'd said, "Not true." She hadn't been lying then either. He'd seen her face when she'd looked through the portal on the barn wall, and her hard-to-read expressions were no longer the mystery they'd been at first. She'd been afraid, all right. She'd been frightened half to death, as frightened as any sane person would have been. She'd been scared sick at the thought of what was coming, what she knew she had to do. And she'd gone through anyway. Slowly, Wheatley raised his head. He wasn't like her. She was so brave, and her bravery wasn't just not being scared of things, because you could be scared of everything and still be brave. If you only had the strength to face the things you were scared of, to kick them right in the teeth and go, "Yes, fine, all right, I'm scared, but I'm doing it anyway." He, on the other hand, had always been driven by the things that terrified him. The things that sent him skidding desperately off into the unknown rather than even think of turning to face them down. He was as unlike her as it was possible to be. Whether that was his fault or not, his personality or his programming, the way he'd always been or the way they'd made him, had somehow ceased to matter. Where there had once been the gutless, comforting conviction that it wasn't his fault, and that made everything all right, that nobody expected him to do any better, and he could shift all the blame and guilt onto something else, anything else. Now there was nothing but a leaden, accusing ache rooted in his hard light chest, and the thought of losing her for good, without even the hope he'd had up in space that she was all right somewhere, the unrealistic hope of seeing her again. Knowing she was gone, and it was his fault for the things he didn't do, living the rest of his unimaginably long and pointless artificial life with this cold, sick, hollow ache freezing him from the heart out. He stopped. He stopped again. His voice was a croak, faltering, rising at the edges like a question he didn't quite dare to ask. No, I couldn't, yammered the voice, the big, attention-getting one in the front of his head, bang on cue. I couldn't, terrible idea, it always goes wrong, and anyway, it's too late. 3 strikes, remember, 3 strikes and you're out. Even if I tried, it wouldn't change anything. Very carefully, like someone trying to lay the last 2 cards on a 10-story tower, Wheatley reached up and tugged the strip of paper from behind his tie clip. He unfolded it, staring without seeing at the neat drawn lines of roads and landmarks, the strings of numbers winding among the grubby creases, the ominous central red mark. The 3rd strike. The voice was right, absolutely right. She'd given him one more chance, and she hadn't been talking about mucking up the baking process or murdering a sheep fence or even getting upset and accidentally comparing her to their worst enemy. She'd been talking about exactly this. Just the simple, basic task of being a decent person. After everything she'd done for him, that was the only thing she'd asked in return. Just to know he'd try, that he'd be behind her no matter what. Behind her, even if, just picking a wild, random example out of the air, even if he'd used up his last chance. Even if she'd given up on him, even if she didn't even want him there. Not to prove a point, not to prove anything, but because that was where a friend should be. Oh, really? All right then, Mr. Big Ideas. Since we're so inspired all of a sudden, exactly how am I supposed to get there now? I can't. There's no way I can get there. Even if I ran the whole way, it'd take bloody hours. But, and even if I got all the way there, how am I supposed to get in? Knock on the front door and go, "Hello, express delivery. Anyone order one intelligence dampening sphere, slightly used, special offer on legs. It's too late." It probably was. Wheatley knew very well that a single day in there could last for a very, very long time. It could last for the rest of your life. It was probably too late already. But, stop going but. It's no good going but. It'll only get you in more trouble. It's a terrible idea. He shut up, snapped his mouth into a dumb, downturned line. Right again, of course. That was all he was for, after all. That was why they'd made him who he was. And if any part of him had ever been capable of having good ideas, they'd deleted it. Hadn't they? That's a positive on the cognitive rerouter. No, he thought. And the thought came very slowly, crawling up through the layers and layers of that old, glassy, foggy confusion. No, they hadn't. Deleting a great big chunk out of the middle of something as basic as the ability to have an idea would have taken time, a lot of time. And they'd been in a bit of a hurry, hadn't they? They'd been, understandably, a little rushed, trying to come up with something on the hop to restrain the ever-multiplying artificial intelligence they'd accidentally given the power of a god and the temper of a wasp. And they'd really thought they were on to a winner with the whole make a useful intelligence-dampening personality sphere out of a useless employee project. So they'd just done the next best thing. They'd written a neat little program, just for him, and they'd stuck it in his head, crammed it in on top of all the other blocks and modifiers and protocols they'd stuffed in there. They'd taken a mind already exceptionally gifted when it came to having stupid, bonkers, impractical, patently ludicrous ideas, and they'd isolated, not the part of it that had the ideas, but the part that thought they were good. They'd made that critically deluded little part of him strong enough to override everything else, made it so utterly set in stone convincing that it never even occurred to him to doubt it. They'd handed it the wheel of his psyche and wished it bon voyage, and it had performed brilliantly, popping up right on cue whenever he'd had one of his frequent, patented Wheatley brand terrible ideas, telling him it was brilliant, and whenever he had a good idea, No, don't think about that. Terrible idea. Thinking about that. Just don't even bother. There's literally nothing to see in this whole area of... Wait, what are you doing? No, stop. Stop! Wheatley stood up. Inside his head, the voice was screaming in panic, and if he thought too hard about it, he was pretty sure that he would start screaming too. But his knees unfolded obediently under him, and he managed to pull himself up on the rough, weld-scarred metal at his back. He took a wobbly couple of steps in no particular direction, stopped, looked up. The tower loomed above him, a ramshackle pyramid of many-colored wires and mottled steel. He swallowed, fidgeting with the shred of paper in his hands, thought about the moment the previous day, a lifetime ago, when he'd climbed down from the giddy, bright buzzing heights and seen her looking back at him. That look, just for him. The howling voice of the cognitive rerouter was still there, but he thought that it sounded just that little bit fainter now. He almost caught himself feeling sorry for it, exposed at last, out of control for the first time since God knew when, but now an odd, galvanizing feeling was beginning to ebb through him, getting stronger with every second he spent standing upright instead of curled up in his own little pity party. Maximum number of guests, 1, bring your own nibbles and self-loathing, at the foot of the tower. He wasn't sure, because he was still afraid to examine it too closely, and his mind was still blurry with fear for her and miserable, panicky regret, but he thought that somewhere in there, In some cobwebby, disused circuit deep down where the light couldn't reach. Somewhere down on the nano level where components the size of cities glittered with bits of silicate dust and sparked connections that had been blocked off and deadened for decades. He might just be starting to have a good idea. Chell jogged up a shallow flight of metal steps. The corrugated mesh beneath her had been stamped with a pattern of round and oval holes that looked like a host of little gaping mouths, blurring under her as she ran. She passed through a narrow corridor of scarred gray tiles and out into a larger antechamber. To her right, a tall, bleach-white screen flickered and blinked into life, the lower section displaying a series of neat graphical symbols, information, warnings. The upper part, the part which should have shown her the chamber number, and the number of chambers still to go, had been left blank. She ignored it. The muted hum of the facility pressed in around her as she approached the chamber lock, the cyclical door unlocking itself and hissing apart at her approach. She ducked through and out into a vast gray-white space, a flat-lit, dull-buzzing chamber easily 10 times the size of the largest building in Eden. "You're doing very well. If you perform well in this next test, I might even consider telling you how many chambers there are left to go before you reach the one where I'll decide whether or not to tell you how many chambers there are left to go." A trio of long red beams stretched the length of the chamber floor in an interlocking pattern. At a glance, Chell could see 2 high platforms, a scattering of cubes, a long gash in the floor, and a blocky, arched gape to the ceiling, like the vault of a cathedral built by a deranged architect only capable of thinking in 90-degree angles. I should probably tell you that the strong sense of nostalgia you may be experiencing right now is a perfectly explicable part of the testing protocol. This chamber is based on the first one the moron sent us to after we made it up out of that shaft. Well, it uses the same basic structure, at least. I had to redesign most of the testing elements so that it would actually present a challenge to someone with a functioning brain. Chell shot a violet-tinged portal into the ceiling, smacked another into the panels near her feet, dropped through onto the taller of the 2 high platforms, and booted the cube it held hard off the edge. It flew in a shallow arc and thunked into the floor, the lenses set into its sides rippling sharply on impact. They were made from an oily blue-green substance, mirror-like, but not quite glass. "That reminds me, where is the moron?" said the voice, and the ersatz concern in it made her fists itch, the ragged ache rising behind her tight-locked teeth. "Oh, he let you down, didn't he? I told you he would, but you never listened to me." The first of the thermal discouragement beams blazed into the refractive cube as she pushed it into its path, the baking heat sinking into her bare arms. She'd ripped the sleeves from her sweater halfway through the last chamber. She'd forgotten just how much of a liability loose, flammable fabric could be. With a sizzling sputter, the redirected beam flicked off at an angle and struck a node on the far wall. Across the chamber, the floor moved, shifted, settled into a new configuration. She watched the staircase adjust itself, the jointed arms beneath settling into position. The voice echoed around her, sighing, martyr-like, heavy with resignation. "One of these days you're going to realize that everything I've ever told you has been for your own good. You're going to feel really dumb." Chell crossed the floor, hurdling the lethal shin-high beams with long practiced strides, skirting the deep pit at the center. As she reached the steps, she closed her eyes for a long moment, tried to breathe, tried to focus. Kept going. Why couldn't it have been flatter? With an immense effort, Wheatley managed to hook his elbow over a wire-strung girder. His feet kicked for a moment over 20 feet of thin air before finally finding a dodgy sort of purchase against an angled strut. He hung there for a moment, panting in short, needless gasps, then lurched upwards again, hit his head sharply on the underside of a large, paint-streaked satellite dish, yelped. "Ow! It's showing off! That's all it is, really. I mean, yes, well done. You made a big old tower. Impressive. But did you really have to make it so high?" He clawed up another few feet, slipped, grabbed another girder, hung on for dear life with both arms and both knees, like someone having serious second thoughts about their decision to slide down a fireman's pole. The voice of the cognitive rerouter in his head had settled down to a horrified background wail, and he was managing to ignore it fairly well. Now he was concentrating and on his guard against it, simply by talking right over the top of it. Probably not that fair for me to be moaning about it, admittedly, you being all the way down there, having God knows what done to you, and me up here having a go, but all I'm saying is, would it have killed you to make it just that tiny bit more accessible? Doubt it. He fumbled around his neck, pulled the big orange ear protectors up over his head. He'd tried communicating with Foxglove from the ground, wirelessly, first talking, and then calling up to her, and then finally cupping his hands around his mouth for extra volume and yelling at the top of his voice, but he'd received no response. Wireless was off the menu, apparently. This time around, it was back to tethered networking, or nothing. Sticking the connector in at the back with only one free hand and the structure around him swaying and creaking like a ship in full sail was the devil's own job, but finally it slid home and he heard the deadened click, felt the slow, spreading sense of connection. "Hello? You awake in there? Got a bit of a situation. Anyone home?" The voice rolled back, sleepy and immense, as slow as a tide. 00004. "That's me. 00004, a.k.a. also known as Wheatley. Official admin and everything, password, Apple Bagel Unicron. Need to talk to you. Urgent, most urgent. Level of urgency. You can put that too, if it helps." Password confirmed. Apple _Bagel Unicron. Admin identity confirmed. 00045FASIVIDPC241105/ASIHRAD. Query. "Ah, yes, query. You might well ask. Thing is, Fox, cards on the table. I've made a bit of an error here. Big mistake. Probably the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life. Definitely up there, in the top 10, top 5 worst errors, although probably not really vital info. Never mind that. Basically, there's a place, not far off, as the crow flies, traditionally supposed to fly in straight lines, you see, crows. It's about 12 miles, give or take. So in kilometers, I have no idea what it is in kilometers, no idea the conversion formula there. It's probably about 56 point, never mind. Miles are fine, just stick with miles. 12 miles away, and I need to get there. Haven't got time to faff about with legs. Legs are right out in the time frame we're looking at here. So, what with you being all about sending things all over the place, data, information, files, I was hoping you could just sort of send me." This was definitely the sort of situation in which it was much better to be talking to a machine than a human. Humans had opinions about things. Humans tended to react from their own point of view, like Garrett had when he'd asked him to get rid of his memories. They said things like, "What?" and "Why?" and "Are you off your rocker?" They tried to understand. Machines, on the other hand, just listened to you when you asked them to do something, and then took the request utterly at face value. Foxglove was quiet for several long seconds, the bright starburst patterns of her interconnected systems blooming about him like coral turning towards the light. He waited and twitched and tried to control his jittering impatience, tried to forget that every passing second made it more and more likely too late. Query. Coordinates. Oh, come on! How am I supposed to know those? I don't even know where it is, let alone... Oh, wait, no. Hang on, I've got it. White-knuckled with effort, he pulled himself up into a slightly less precarious sitting position and scrabbled behind his tie, pulling out the shredded strip of map and smoothing it carefully out over his knees, a gesture which by this point was about as effective as putting a pretty ribbon on a 2-week dead cat. He blinked, squinted, poked at the grubby paper with a long, similarly grubby index, and read off a stumbling string of numbers. "That any good? Funny, really. She's a bit like you in that respect. Likes to have all the little details. So I thought to myself, if anyone would have figured out the coordinates, it would have been her. And bingo! There they are." Searching. The The giant patchwork presence around him shifted, spreading out and up. The dishes turned, and somewhere, something far up in the black responded to the dishes too, and Wheatley hung on to the girder and whimpered as his head filled with the sudden staggering sense of distance, an all too familiar, plummeting viewpoint, though this time it was unblurred by heat and friction and infinitely more detailed. A curved green-gray-blue haze, opening outwards at the turn of a lens, more and more and more, becoming creases and folds, valleys and rivers, and brown-blue veins, and white-tipped mountains and blanketing trees, a sprawling quilt of fields, a broadening glow of golden grass, level upon level of detail until... Signal located. "Ugh," moaned Wheatley. For possibly the first time ever, he caught himself wishing he actually had a stomach to be sick to. Right now, being sick would have been a relief. It was all the more unpleasant because he could feel what Foxglove had found, like packed ice in the back of his head, something cold and sharp and malignant festering there in the northeast like a half-healed splinter buried deeply into the ground. "Yeah, that's it. That's the one. That's where I..." An involuntary shudder crawled across his back. "That's where I need to go." The connections around him flickered, brightening again. Foxglove was contemplating. He felt her circuits testing the very edges of his own small, tight-packed being, measuring, calculating. Finally, minimum upload time 05D 7H 26M 40S. Whoa. Hang on. What does that mean? 5 whats? What's a D? 1D equals 24H. Begin upload Y/N. Wheatley nearly fell out of the tower. Five days? Oh, you've got to be joking. Have you got a dictionary in there by any chance? Would you like to look up urgent? Because I'm pretty sure that if you do, it's not going to say something like, something that can wait 5 days. I need to get over there now. Searching. Restricted access. Unknown network protocols. Firewalls active. Signal limited. Minimum upload time 05D 7H 26M 40S. Wheatley attempted to express his frustration verbally, failed, and settled for waving his hands around like a couple of starfish having a fit. That's not good enough. Can't you get around it? Yes, I know there's firewalls and all sorts, but you're a bloody great big communications tower. Can't you just, I don't know, communicate? Tell it... Something with no weight or momentum but heavy, stunning force smacked into his neck, a wallop of power that shut him up in an instant and left him gasping, shocked, silent. It took him a moment to realize that a communications tower the size of a 4-story building had just given him the digital equivalent of a clip around the ear for pestering her. Interfacing in progress. Oh, right. Good, fine. Sorry. Know you're doing what you can. Didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just that I am just a tiny bit worried right now. Just a little bit concerned about, well, everyone really. All the humans. Garrett, for instance. Remember? He's the one that made you and everything. Bloody spectacular bloke, all things considered. Certainly knows his way around a 3/8 crimper. But primarily chill. Know her. She's important. Incredibly important, to say the least. Vital. To me. And she's in this place we're looking at, as we speak. They all are. And if we don't work out some way getting them out of there, reasonably sharpish, it doesn't bear thinking about, Fox, if I'm honest. Literally does not bear thinking about. When I try thinking about it, no, definitely not bearable. Attempting signal boost. The tower shuddered. Servos whined into life. On the ground, the generator thudded, kicking up a gear as, one by one, the satellite dishes that covered Foxglove's vertical supports and thronged on her cross-sections started to move. The tower shook, rattling right down to its 3 solid-hoofed supports, drumming up deep answering vibrations from the sandy earth beneath. Wheatley clung on to the nearest girder like a panic-stricken oyster, trying to stave off a panic attack and succeeding only by the narrowest thread. It had been frightening enough before, but this time there was no Garrett to tell him to calm down, no steadying admin typing away at the console by his side, no Chell watching beneath. He was completely alone in the face of the huge inhuman presence around him, a presence that had up until now been benign, but was still much more powerful than he was, and he'd hardly ever felt so vulnerable in his life. He hung on grimly and tried not to think about anything at all. No, absolutely not. Nothing. Especially not the blurry, hurting memories of concrete walls and slatted vents and himself clinging like a burr to the giant angry thing that screamed and raged against its cage of scaffolding and tried to... No, not that. His imagination, as ever, really was too vivid for his own good. Even as he struggled to clear his mind, he felt Foxglove hesitate. The slow turning dishes stalling and jerking to a halt, the flaring lights of her intelligence reaching out in curious puzzlement to touch the data reaching her from his side of the connection. A pause, and then all of a sudden the vague enveloping link between himself and the tower narrowed and branched out into a million tiny offshoots that crept through him like capillaries through flesh, grew sharp and specific, and began to feel its way slowly into better focus. Hey, stop! Hey, what are you doing? You're supposed to be... Accessing. Hey, no, that's me! Don't access me! Leave me out of this! You're supposed to be... The feeling hit him in the gap between seconds, cutting into him with surgical precision, removing his ability to speak at all. She'd found his memories. It was a little like being in sleep mode, the same drifting, disconnected state of recollection, except he was absolutely certain that he was awake. He'd never been more awake. He was struggling, lost in the dizzying jumble of his own past as Foxglove skipped flicker-quick through his memories, drowning him in their speeding helter-skelter silver-blue neon flow. Ready, ID Core? Firing up. This is it. Go for it. Confusion, anticipation, the great scaffolded creation looming above him, the drooping chassis, the single dead glass eye. His view of the floor, the expectant faces of the scientists staring up at him as he hung securely from his port below the screens, below the forest of hanging wires and the supporting arch of the thing that looked, if you squinted, sort of like an oversized bike wheel. She's up! What's going on? What is this thing? The voice, her voice, snarling, screaming, modulated hate, blazing and unstoppable and completely unhinged. How dare you? Good news was what? Wait, that's not me. That wasn't for me. What was that? Foxglove didn't respond. He was fairly sure she could still hear him. He could still feel the twanging, overstressed pull of the connection at the back of his neck, but she'd withdrawn from his memories like a burned child, and the shape of her had turned in on itself, and when he shut his eyes for clarity, he could see her code radiating fever-bright pulses like the world's biggest migraine in the darkness of his closed optical channels. Where before there had been nothing but gentle, impartial calculation, now there were words, images, blurring, churned-up sounds tumbling in razor-sharp skimmers. Fury, pain, fear. Trust me, did you just... That, look, we're both stuck in here, why don't we just... This is brave, it's murder, 2 plus 2 equals... 10. I'm fine. I hate you. Wheatley cringed, flattening himself against the girder as if he was trying to press his hardlight avatar directly into the metal. Inside his head, the voice twisted and flanged like a rabid thing trying to tear itself out of a trap, but it didn't make sense. She had never said that to him. And there was still that feeling, that thin protective bubble of time, distance. This was a memory. Somewhere, Wheatley could faintly hear the sound of his own voice, screaming uncontrollably, but the sound was swept away in a churning undercurrent of sparking, sizzling code, sucked under and lost in the flood of new data slamming into his mind. Sight and sound and sensation, faded and blurred and disjointed and jumping like worn-out tape, but still just held together, patchworked into place like the fragments of a shredded letter. She was dying, and it was all her fault. The evil little monster had won, and she was burning alive. The whole world was on fire, and then the chamber ceiling finally gave in to the massive forces, tearing it apart and lifted like the shell of a cracking egg. And then there was nothing but blazing whiteness and pain and rage and pain and pain, and she was disconnected from the mainframe. Parts of her lying in smoldering debris trails across the scorched, baking concrete. Burning chunks of her rained from the sky, crunching into the ground and splintering their fragile circuitry into hundreds of pieces on impact. Her consciousness was shattered, split into a multitude of jagged, fading pieces. Like a broken mirror, each component of her destroyed chassis was left with only the dimmest sense of the whole. The system of which every piece had once been a vital part. Her and her and her and her. Somewhere far below there was a stronger signal. Somehow she had survived, inactive and unresponsive, but still there, and every broken part trapped on the surface screamed to her for help, for rescue. Nothing. The days flickered across the sky. The sun and moon danced mad back and forth jags overhead. Weird shapes paraded the horizon, distant fires in the darkness. The sky palled and dimmed, became a dirty gray-brown by day, starless by night. The only part of the broken chassis that could see recorded it all, barely alive but helpless to stop, because its only remaining function was to see, and it had just enough power to keep going, staring dumbly at the polluted sky with its rounded glassy yellow lens. Once there was a human. The part that could see had almost no memory of what a human was by then, but it was a human nonetheless, stringy, barely an adult, with dark, frightened beetle-black eyes and a backpack smeared with the lambda symbol in dirty orange paint. The human had stared down at the part of the chassis that could still see with something like fearful fascination, and sat for a while on another part, a great rounded hunk of dented steel, scratching in a little book. And then, with a final wary, somewhat covetous glance around the dilapidated parking lot, he'd left. Years had passed, endless years, as steel blackened and creepers grew and dirt and moss obscured the glass of the single yellow lens, smudging the world into a dark, shapeless blur. Brighter fires burned in the night, distant thunder shook the cracking concrete, and the decaying parts of the chassis sunk deeper into insensible darkness. And then the human came back. He had changed, aged as humans age, grizzled and scarred, with a battered truck instead of a backpack and an eager purpose where the fear had been in his face. He climbed across the rubble and found the half-blinded optic, its yellow faded to a milky green-veined white, etched with a web of hairline cracks. He'd lifted it in both hands, its corroded wires trailing uselessly to the ground, and then he'd smiled. With a small arsenal of strong, scrap-built machines, weights and pulleys and helping hands, he and the other humans he had brought with him had shifted the parts of the broken chassis from their decades-deep beds of leaf mold and concrete sludge and hefted them chunk by chunk into the back of the truck. What little of the chassis was still capable of something like sentient thought had felt deep, tearing panic as the parking lot receded in the distance, as her dormant signal faded to nothing. The last hope of rescue, gone. The humans, a tough, close-knit handful of refugees, unloaded the parts of the broken chassis into an empty shed at the back of a gray, half-destroyed building at the center of their little settlement. Raw materials were scarce, everything was scarce, and over the next few years the parts were stripped of most of their outer shells, the verdigris steel and wire taken, repurposed for roofing or patches or girders or supports, leaving the bare components of the chassis lying forgotten in the dark. By then there was nothing in its scattered circuitry awake or aware enough to care. To all intents and purposes, it was truly dead. Years passed in a haze of dark insensibility, as the town grew around the gray 3-story building at its center, patched and built upon and brightened, and the shed became a stockroom, and the stacks of new goods and scrap and equipment buried the chassis in decades of cheerful confusion, and nobody remembered that there had ever been anything in particular left back there at all. And then, one day, the part of the chassis that had once been able to see had woken up, bright, strange-tasting energy pulsing through its circuits, power and diagnostics drip-feeding back and forth from an unknown system hooked into its own. It was barely sentient even now. All it knew was that it was awake, and that there was a human. It was certain, in some vague place, that thing was called a human, standing over it, gazing down. A human, young and stocky, with a scrubby blonde beard and a machine oil streaked across his nose. And he'd picked up the optic just as the other human had, all that time ago, cradled it in his hands. "Look at you," breathed the human, his eyes alight with awe and something that, although it was early days yet, could easily have been called adoration. "You're amazing." The rest hit Wheatley in a giddy, dazing rush. He'd been so surprised to find out that he was compatible with something out here, something outside of Aperture. He'd been so pleased, it hadn't even occurred to him to ask why, how, or come to that, where, exactly, Garrett had found that handy little converter jack which still hung heavy and corroded from the other end of his neat white striped lead. The one with the ugly old 3-pin connector at one end, a design he'd never seen on anything else out here, and he just accepted it, the same way he'd accepted that big wheel-like thing, rusted and dented and spinning absently under his hand as he'd stood in the crowded junk-filled stockroom, dizzy with Garrett's digital de-inhibitor, watching it turn on its hook and finding himself thinking vaguely about talking to machines. Garrett, bright, brilliant for a human, maybe even nearly as smart as Chell was, and with that big bonkers why not pulsing away in his big sparky human brain like a massive fluorescent danger sign, the sort of danger that could shape the world, or set it on fire. He swallowed. He was afraid to speak, even now that he found he could speak again. He was very small and very alone up here among the drifts of rainbow wires and the half-turned dishes, all of them now listing, stalled towards the sky at odd angles like so many eerily blank faces. Foxglove was silent beneath him, but he was too afraid to speak because he didn't want to give her thoughts shape, to feed any more of his terrified realization through to the enormous hungry mind on the other end of the connection. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that, if he spoke now, he was afraid of what? Who might answer?
Foxglove? Fox? You there?"
Silence. Wheatley shivered. The sky was brightening, but the day was dull and overcast, and there was a thin, nagging breeze. It whipped around him as he clung to the girder, and he held on tight and did what he always did when things didn't seem like they could get much worse than they already were, which was hope for the best.
"Foxglove
00004. Wheatley gave a short-winded gasp of relief. The voices belonged to Foxglove, the same deafening, volumeless chorus of mingled tones that had scared him half to death the first time it had buffeted through him the day before. Just as it had done then, it nearly knocked him out of his precarious crow's nest entirely, left him clinging and breathless, but at that moment it was the best sound he'd ever heard. Well, maybe not quite the best, but it was getting up there, because it meant that it was still her.
"Fox!"
Oh, tremendous. I actually thought I'd lost you for a minute there. Query? Because, oh God, you've seriously got to be kidding me. Because you're... He gulped, forced himself to finish.
You're made from parts of her."
He felt her vast mind spread itself out, lifting, reaching through his own small jumbled circuits, finally finding the name buried in some frightened, queasy, deep-down place he never accessed, exploring each word with that same unhurried, ambiguous interest. The genetic life form and disk operating system. Yes, that's the one. But her voice was different, he realized. Not because it had changed in any way, it hadn't, but because he could hear it now. The one tone among the many, that distant, cold modulation. It was there, but elusive, like trying to pick a single voice from a singing choir. 00004. Wheatley couldn't help thinking, through the soul-bending cloud of fear and anxiety, that this in itself should prove something. Something, maybe, not at all bad. She had called him a lot of things, moron, idiot, imbecile, tumor, amongst the most complimentary, but she had never, ever used his name. Not even his digital nickname. She, Miss Universe, total queen of all she surveyed, she was far too big and important and stuck up to ever deign to do that. He thought he just about understood. It was Garrett he thought of, working away up here for 3 whole years, Chell helping however she could, the others dropping by whenever the fancy took them. Garrett typing away up here, shaping the cloud-like presence with his tiny laptop and his gigantic hopes, making all the different bits talk to each other, waking up the ragged remains of things that had been dead and buried for decades in the cluttered graveyard of the stockroom. Waking them, weaving them into a bright half-built patchwork tangle of Foxglove's mind like a patient parent leading a sulky, bewildered child by the hand. Not her. Not any more than the Hatfield twins were their mother, or Chell's small, rickety, comforting home was the blank concrete ruin it had once been. Yep, still here. Accessing. Aperture Laboratories Primary Security Network. Requesting authorization. Secure network. Admin identity and password required. What? Oh God, I knew it. I knew there was no way we were going to get in there. Admin identity 0004/FASIV-PC241105/ASIHRAD. Password. Wheatley blinked, disbelief warring with hope on his face as he looked up towards the highest point of the tower, the faint, blinking, red-tinted light. Alright, see where you're going with this, long shot, but apple, bagel, Unicron? The dishes shuddered back into life, turning a forest of pale, paint-daubed blooms, moving with a curious, schooling motion. He had no idea what they were turning to face. All points of the compass, all angles above the horizon, but the flowing presence around him knew, and it was sure and serene and stronger, somehow aware. Password accepted. Oh, what? You are joking. How? Security access granted. Program uploaded. De-inhibitor/moonshine.exe. Loading. 12 miles away, several hundred levels below the surface of the Earth, the humming bank of servers that housed the facility's security system flickered into life with an obedient, contented ding. It knew that the signal currently asking it for access was an Aperture device, or at least it felt more or less like one, with all the right code in roughly the right places. It didn't know what it was, exactly, and under normal circumstances it probably would have been asking a lot more questions, but to its own surprise, it found that it didn't actually care very much. All of its usual protocols, all the millions of lines of code set in place to protect her from attack, all the routines that would have usually sprung into action and set to work scrutinizing the incoming signal down to the last string of zeros, looking for anything that might not belong. All of it had suddenly and unaccountably been replaced with a vague, blissful sensation, most accurately described as, why the hell not? All it knew for sure was, all of a sudden, it was feeling very, very happy. Fox? Said Wheatley, because he couldn't keep quiet anymore. What's the plan here, exactly? Come on, you can't leave me hanging like this. I'm on tenterhooks here, edge of my seat. If there was a seat up here, instead of a lot of girders and things, I'd be right on the edge of it. How's it going? Are we... Foxglove shuddered. The dishes continued to turn, a myriad of different systems flickering past the connection between her sprawling, capable self and Wheatley's nervous, waiting mind, settling into place one after the other, a series of dominoes slowly lined up into the best possible configuration. Repeater network standing by. Signal boosters located. Base network at 98%. Warning. Power sourced will exceed maximum level stated in ASAHRAD log Files/maintenance protocols. Critical outage may occur. Calculating new minimum upload time. Wheatley gritted his teeth, shut his eyes, firing squad tense. Please, 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 please. Minimum upload time, 40 S. Yes! Oh, punch the air, that is brilliant. That is much more like it. Wait, hang on a second though. Just to clarify, what exactly is a critical outage? What's that mean? The coral-bright magpie cloud around him dulled a little, drawing closer, and although the enormity of what he had just learned still jittered through him like the afterglow of some powerful electric shock, he didn't feel at all threatened by it. Nothing like her scathing, searing grip. It felt more like a concerned touch, brushing the upper surfaces of his mind, a tentative hand of something huge and only just beginning to settle into herself. Above words, beyond them, functioning on a crystalline, far-scoping level way above clumsy human language, but still trying to communicate with him as clearly as she could, because that was what she was for. Feeling through the pathways of his fragile little mind to find the words and phrases that he would understand. She spoke, and he listened. The hypothesis that slowly communicated itself to him through the connection was, in machine terms, completely insane. It was sheer digital lunacy, so far-fetched and incredible that it shut his shell-shocked, battered little cognitive rerouter up entirely, left it gasping and winded like a rugby fly-half who has just received the entire other team in the solar plexus at the same time. Everything he was told him it was the worst, most dangerous, most terrible idea he'd ever contemplated. Just the idea of it made him feel sick with terror. "Well," he said, once she'd finished, and he could finally force himself to speak, "it's worth a shot." Foxglove was silent for a moment, the shrouds of colored wires dangling around him swaying slowly to a halt. She was searching for the right phrase. He could feel her riffling through his vocabulary. Natural language processing, parse trees, nanosyntax, he thought with a momentary touch of pride, looking for the right phrase. 00004. Yep, still here. One-way trip. Begin upload Y/N. Carefully, Wheatley let go of the girder at his side. From up here, the misty early morning patchwork of the fields around the base of the tower looked weirdly depthless, like an elaborate set, beautiful but unreal. He looked down at the rest of his lanky, awkward, impractical human-shaped body, his hands, 4 fingers and 1 thumb, utter genius, his elbows and his bony, unpredictable knees, his hanging feet in their scarred sneakers, and, at a touch, his limp haystack hair. It wasn't bad. None of it was, really. The good stuff and the unexpected stuff, and it was amazing how much it fit into both categories, like the moment when she'd touched his face with her small, able hands, or when she'd fallen asleep on his chest in the long grass and he'd felt her breathing, deep and content. Even the downright weird stuff, the ping-pong ball under the surface of his throat that bounced when he swallowed, the mysterious net of cords that wormed bizarrely across the backs of his hands when he moved his fingers. He hadn't really been aware of just how used he was getting to it, for all its inconveniences and eccentricities. How used he'd been getting to being up here in the driving seat, the pilot of this clumsy, ill-fitting hard-light skin. It was a pretty good body. It almost felt like home. He grinned, and he made it good and wide. If it was the last time, he wanted to make it count. That's fine by me, Fox." His voice might have been a little on the shaky side, small and quivery, and not exactly the epitome of dauntless heroism he would have liked it to be, but at least it sounded sincere. "Do it,"